Levy is the author of a number of influential and useful books on pretreatment, the skills of outreach and engagement with people who are homeless. Here, in his home in Western Massachusetts, we are discussing the way Housing First evolved and developed from being a practical, quite creative response to the situation that outreach workers will sometimes find with people who are excluded from services, and how it gradually turned into a policy program with a number of rigidities and dilemmas that then creates.
Sure. And you and I know, both very into trying to find the right words and how we are often misled by the language we're using. So tell me your take on Housing First and pies and how and to what extent it fits together at all. Are we describing the same world?
Yes. Well, I think we're coming at it from different angles. We're all interested in better ways to serve people who are homeless, and I think how to be trauma informed and psychologically informed, and to respond really to what people want and need. And I think if you were to ask, and they've done surveys of people who are homeless and on the ground, what's their interest? What would they like? And more than 90% will say, I want to be housed. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to work on.
Interestingly, 10% maybe you won't.
Well, it's not an exact number. So,
yeah.
But there is some percentage that will say, no, I'm not interested in being housed. And that's a whole nother thing to get into and talk about. I find through outreach and really connecting with these folks over time, even the vast majority who wouldn't say that up front will then be very open to housing and see it as something very positive. But it's all about how it's offered and talked about and framed.
And once it's a real option that really feels real to them, with people who they can trust help them through it, then suddenly there's more of a real choice than there was before.
What I'm fond of saying, and I know there's an anonymous author out there that said this somewhere, I don't believe it was me, and that is people are afraid to hope. And what you need to be able to do is to show them what's really possible, real, tangible. And sometimes if it's kind of theoretical, a person might be very adapted, because transition and adaptation is a big part of this. They might be very adapted to living outside and being homeless and roughing it and this kind of thing. And they might feel a certain sense of freedom and even empowerment and meaning in their world.
And community and having a real role and friendships and so on.
So some people don't want to leave that to be housed and have to deal with a landlord and bills and financial issues and neighbors and be up close. Some people like kind of being more sort of out there and doing things in a more independent way, or also having their own community that they can more freely choose.
For me, one of the really strong experiences and memories from this trip is your colleague Brendan talking about the way he works with that whole homelessness community and treats them as a legitimate community in their own right, with as much respect and membership and entrance and exits and so on, marked with some ceremony even. I mean, that was a really powerful recognition of how important a sense of community and relationships are, whether you're housed or not.
No, that's absolutely.
That is the environment. The environment we live within is other people.
Yes, and so many of the people we house through Housing First and other types of programming often become quite isolated, have a lot of difficulty building a community while housed, or they might even go out and visit their old community or try to keep ties to it. And sometimes that works well. Sometimes it actually causes problems in the housing in terms of inviting people into their place and some of the issues that play out with neighbors. So I think Housing First was really an attempt to try to get it right in regard to what people wanted who were homeless. And I think, I'm fond of saying, and I've said this very often, that Housing First has been around a long time. It's only recently that it became kind of programmed and funded. But I think any outreach worker that I would say had value in the field, that was really connected to what they were doing, from time to time would try a Housing First kind of approach. If you had someone that was being found ineligible to get into all these other forms of housing, these different programs like substance abuse programming. They were ineligible because they weren't sober and they weren't going into treatment. It was this big continuum of care push toward treatment first. So housing first was really about offering the housing first as opposed to the treatment.
Turned it on its head.
Turned it on its head. And then as people moved in, you try to build the supports around them and then work on pathways to getting the kind of care that might be helpful to the person.
And for some people, certainly that seems to have been an absolute breakthrough. And particularly the people that the previous way of doing things were failing.
Exactly.
You know,
that's what it was built for, really, for that subgroup.
But what worries me is that I'm now seeing Housing First seen as the solution to everything. The solution that worked with those people who the previous system didn't work for is now being regarded as what you should do with everybody, and that can sometimes seem to mean removing the funding and undermining things that actually were working for a segment of that population.
I absolutely agree with that. I think it's been overgeneralized. I think this is what tends to happen. We find something that works, we overgeneralize it, and then we start to diminish the other things that were actually working well in the past with other populations. All of a sudden they can't get the funding they used to get. Everything becomes housing first funding. And I think that's a real problem, and there's a real danger in that. You even see that within the very much the shelter system itself. They started reducing shelter capacity in some cases, closing entire shelters, saying we're putting that money toward housing first. It should not be a dichotomy like that. I mean, because they were doing that even prior to proving that the numbers were really coming down due to the housing first approach.
If you reduce the shelter population and the shelter funding to put money into housing first, but also to put it into some transitional housing where that meets the right need, and even some of the safe havens, the really intensively supported homes for people who are, who can't even manage permanent supportive housing, then you've got quite a variegated pattern that can really, you can find what suits each individual. Whereas as soon as you have one thing which everybody's got to do and you're not allowed to do anything else, I can't help thinking this can't be right.
But there was a bit of
be flexible.
There was a bit of zealousness with the way they reduced shelter capacity. It wasn't as much as we talk about data driven. It wasn't data driven because they were doing it on the expectation that this was going to work and it was going to work for everybody. And then what we found is, there's other variables that come into why the homeless numbers are what they are. So it's not all about housing first. In other words, is not a panacea for reducing homelessness, especially not in terms of ending homelessness. There's a lot of economic drivers that are very, very significant.
Let alone political. I mean, in the States, more than in England, you get such extraordinary varieties between different jurisdictions, different political leadership, and that can have such an impact on the funding. And plus, of course, Medicaid. Medicaid's going to come into this conversation any moment now. I know it is.
So we need to be careful with this, is what I'm saying, and thoughtful and caring, right? I mean, that's what we do. And we need the data piece that's being done and the decisions on funding to follow that kind of care, where you really look and get a perspective over time as to what's working and with whom and what subpopulation, what type of housing is for. And then through that, start to get some real good measures in regard to, well, with these targeted approaches, to what degree are we really bringing down shelter numbers and unsheltered numbers? I mean, if you look at it, really, a lot of Housing First was designed primarily for the unsheltered population. So it's kind of funny in a way to say, well, we're doing a lot of Housing First, and now we're going to reduce shelter capacity. You see what I'm saying? In the United States,
there's an irony in that.
Yeah, we have 175,000 people or more who are unsheltered, living outside, sleeping rough, as you say, in England and the UK, and it's really that's a tremendous number when you think about it. In California alone, over 75,000 people sleeping rough.
And you were saying in Hawaii, it's 1 in 100 of the population, which is...
In terms of homelessness in general, like sleeping rough and shelters, which is a tremendously high number. So there is, people, a lot of towns and cities want to get rid of their shelters. They see it as a quality of life issue for the other residents, and they'd like to have less homelessness in their town, and they fear that the shelters are a magnet that bring certain subpopulations of homeless individuals in. They fear that it takes from the quality of life.
If we provide that, if you build it, they will come.
So if we have housing first, someone can say, that's what we're doing. Let's close the shelter. You see what I mean? And that becomes more of a political kind of way of looking at things, but not one that's really data-based.
No, it's more rhetoric and what plays with the newspapers. We must come a little bit. We must touch on 2 or 3 other models. I think.